Hey, seventh graders, how you doing? This is Mr. Garnett Cook. I hope you had a good week. Hope you're having a good weekend. This screencast is a preview of the coming week's focus, which is going to be the city-states of Sparta and Athens. They were the two most powerful city-states in Greece during Greece's what they call sort of golden age, the sort of peak period from about, I would say, the sixth and fifth centuries to about the fourth and third centuries. These were the two most powerful cities in Greece. And we've already learned about, what a city-state is and what city-states had in common. And what's interesting about Sparta and Athens is how different they were. If we think about them geographically, for example, they're very close together, actually, geographically, but couldn't have been more different as cities. They had a couple things in common, but a lot of differences, and those differences will lead to conflict. I want to start with a couple of images that I think, accurately reflect what people typically think of when they think of Sparta versus Athens. The image of Sparta is military might. This is how they're often portrayed in ancient literature and in modern popular culture. Think about it. There's a movie came out several years ago called 300, which is about the Spartans at a battle you'll be learning about this week, the Battle of Thermopylae. And they're portrayed as these great warriors, and Sparta was a warrior city state for sure. So the image of Sparta is often military strength. The image on the right is what people typically think of when they think of Athens. Athens was a democracy during its heyday, and the image of Athens is typically citizens gathered in an open space discussing and debating political issues of the day. And so you can see these two guys here who are sort of running the debate, and all the citizens of Athens are gathered to participate in the debate. So that's what people typically think of when they think of Athens during this time period. Now, this obscures and simplifies certain things. So, for example, there certainly was a lot of debate in Sparta, and there were times when Athens had a tremendous amount of military strength. But when people think of one city versus the other, these are often the images that come to mind. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about some of the differences between Athens and Sparta. You could be learning a little bit more about this during the course of this week. So I'm gonna talk about Athens first. Just a couple of general points to introduce each city state, and again, some of the assignments this week will expand on it a little bit more. Athens is located in a region of mainland Greece called Attica, and Attica is sort of southeastern Greece. I'm circling it right here on the map. And in the Attica region, Athens was, without question, the most powerful city. At its height, it was a democracy. It's one of the first known places in the world to experiment with a democratic form of government. One of the readings you'll do this week will get into more detail about what Athenian democracy actually looked like. But at various points in its history, Athens had monarchy, it had oligarchy, and then ultimately it experimented with democracy at its height. Although a democracy that was not quite so democratic. One of the things that you'll also read is that the only people who actually got to participate in Athenian democracy were adult male property owners. And that eliminated a lot of people from public life in Athens. I think only somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people living in Athens actually qualified to participate in Athenian democracy. Athens was a city that looked outward. They were an outward looking city. They were constantly looking to trade across the Mediterranean. They were always looking for new lands to settle, new colonies. Athens is going to build a very strong navy specifically for that purpose. But Athens was a city that was looking to make connections with other parts of the Mediterranean world. And finally, Athens, particularly at its height, is known for its education, for its arts, for its literature, for its architecture. This is a city that's going to be associated with kind of the peak of civilization in a lot of ways. There are great playwrights that come out of Athens. There are great philosophers that come out of Athens. There are great writers, history writers, that come out of Athens. Athens is sort of the center of culture in the Greek world in many ways. And finally, an interesting sort of irony that in a city that was known for its democracy, women had few, if any, rights in Athens. Women were really, considered second-class citizens, and had very few rights at all. And there are a lot of there's a lot of ancient literature that references that. There's some Athenian art that reference that reality. So the irony that in this democracy, where supposedly people are being given a lot more power than they ever had before, women had very few rights. Sparta, a very, very different city-state in some important ways. Sparta is located on this region of Greece called the Peloponnesus. It was certainly not the only city, but it certainly was the most powerful city. And eventually, they're going to build alliances with other cities in the Peloponnesus. This is what will lay the groundwork for what will be called the Peloponnesian War, which we'll be coming to. Sparta was an oligarchy at its height. It was governed primarily by a small number of men called ephors, who made most of the decisions in Spartan government. But there were two kings of Sparta. Kings primarily led religious services and commanded the military in battle during times of war. Sparta also had what was called an assembly of people who could vote, although their assembly had very, very limited power. The ephors had most of the power in Sparta. Sparta was a place that looked inward. They were not people who traded across the Mediterranean. They didn't have any colonies. They purposefully stayed isolated. And one of the reasons for this, at least according to the literature that has survived, more than half of the population of Sparta were made up of people called helots. And helots were slaves. And there was a constant fear in Sparta of slave uprisings, justified fears, by the way. And so they were afraid that if they stretched themselves too thin by expanding across the Mediterranean, they would leave Sparta vulnerable to slave rebellions. And so Sparta very purposefully stayed close to home to guard against that happening. Sparta emphasized military education. This is one of the things you're going to learn this week in one of the readings. If you're a young boy in Sparta, your life is given over to the military. To be a soldier and to serve the city-state as a soldier is one of the highest honors you can have. It was drummed into kids' heads from very early on. The military training in Sparta was brutal, but the idea was to create an army that was devoted to the defense of the city-state. Women, ironically, in this place had more power. And one of the reasons for that, and more rights, not a lot of political power, but other kinds of power, and they were generally speaking more respected. Reason for this is that from the time they were 7 years old, Spartan men were off in the military. They were professional full-time soldiers. So somebody had to manage the land. And those responsibilities often fell to women. And women were, for that reason, among others, considered very important, actually, in Spartan society. Now, they had some things in common. The first is both Athens and Sparta depended on slavery. I mentioned the Helots already, but Athens had slavery too. One of the things, there's a video you can watch if you choose to, that you can find on modules this week. If you watch the video about Athens, it actually gets into the fact that silver was what made the city rich, but the silver mines were mined by slaves. So Athens was very much a city that was built on the backs of slave labor. So both Athens and Sparta depended on slavery. Both had military strength. Again, Sparta's more well known for it. And Spartan soldiers, those people who are called the hoplite soldiers, that's the heart of Spartan military strength. Athens, however, had a very strong navy. And for a period of time, they had the best ships on the Mediterranean. So the Athenian navy gave them a lot of military power. And both the cities denied women political rights, although, as I mentioned already, Sparta gave women more rights and more power, certainly, than Athens did. So two very powerful, very different city-states, but both are going to have a huge impact on the history of Greece from this period, from about the 6th century through the 4th century. The other thing you're going to be learning about this week is the Persian Wars. There are two major military conflicts that will shape the history of ancient Greece. The later one we'll get to next week is the Peloponnesian War. This week, you'll get an opportunity to learn about the Persian Wars. At the time that Athens and Sparta and the Greek city-states in general were sort of reaching the height of their power, the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean world was the Persian Empire. And you can see a map here. The Persians at one point controlled a tremendous amount of territory. Territory as far west as Egypt and beyond, across the Eastern Mediterranean over here, and as far east as the border of modern-day India. So the Persian Empire, I believe, in terms of actual square miles, may have been the biggest empire in the ancient world up until the Romans. And they may even have been bigger than the Roman Empire at its height. I'm not exactly sure. It's very close, but the Persians had a huge empire. And if you look up here, you can see that the Persian Empire extended right to the border of the Greek world. The Persians had this territory across what is modern-day Turkey. Let me go back. So they're right across the Aegean Sea from Greece and the Greek city-states. And this sort of butting up against the Greeks is what's going to pave the way for conflict, because one of the things that's going to happen is that there are going to be some cities along the coast of modern-day Turkey here that are going to rise up in rebellion against the Persians. They're going to be backed and supported by Athens, actually. The Persians are going to get really mad at Athens, and they're going to march an army or try to march an army into Greece, essentially to conquer Athens. And eventually they're going to try to conquer all the Greek city-states. And that will pave the way for what is known as the Persian Wars, which will be fought on and off over the course of about 20 years. The Persian Wars, in a nutshell, is a story of the Persian Empire's attempt, unsuccessfully, to conquer Greece. And it's a great story of one of the only few times, really, in the history of ancient Greece when the Greek city-states united together. And in this case, it's uniting together to repel a common enemy. The threat of the Persians is going to bring a lot of the Greek cities together, including Sparta and Athens. They are going to be, at one point, allies in this conflict against the Persians. And it's going to be a combination of both of them that will be decisive in stopping the Persian invasion. And in the wake of the Persian Wars, those two cities, Athens and Sparta, will rise as by far the most powerful cities in Greece, because they will have been so instrumental in the victory over the Persians. So you'll be learning a little bit more about Athens and Sparta this week. You'll be learning more about the Persian Wars this week. Next week, we'll be shifting our attention to the events that lead up to the Peloponnesian War and the Peloponnesian War itself. Anyway, that's all for now. Check modules for the assignments this week. If you have any questions, you can email me. Until then, have a good week.